Okay, so welcome to my talk, Delivering the Impossible, a short talk about how to rule the world. Software is eating everything. That is one of the main inspirations for this talk, is the idea that software is eating everything. And that was said by a chap called Mark Anderson, who you might not have heard of, but it's quite important because he wrote one of the first web browsers, and now he runs a company that invests in tech. And he said that about 10, 12 years ago. What does he mean that software is eating everything? What he means is that every aspect of our lives, in some way, software is becoming more and more involved. So if you want to meet somebody for romance or sex, you probably use some kind of dating app. If you're hungry, you probably call Deliveroo, or you order to get a delivery from the supermarket. If you want to watch the television, you're probably going to watch Netflix. So like every aspect of your life, software is creeping in and becoming more and more involved. I was going to try and put a joke in there, but I won't. So software is eating everything. That is the point. And this is important for people, even if they're not involved in software development. I am involved in software development. I've been involved in software development now for over 20 years. And so I've become really, really interested in how difficult it is to manage software development. Because what we see with the whole business of software eating everything is that the people who own that software are the most powerful people in the world. The people who own that software are people like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, even, God forbid, Elon Musk. So this is a really important aspect of life now. The second quote that inspired me for this talk is a quote by a chap called Alan Kay, who again you might not have heard of. If you know anything about software development, you will have heard of him because he's the inventor of something called object-oriented software development. But he used to work at a place called the Palo Alto Research Center, which is Xerox's research center in California, which is where pretty much everything about personal computing was invented, and then it was stolen by Steve Jobs. So the whole idea of point of view being worth 80 IQ points is that if you look at things in the right way, you can be much smarter. If you look at things in the wrong way, you can be very, very dumb. So what we want to be doing when we're trying to solve any problem, when we're trying to solve any difficult problem, is to look at things in the right way. Another tech bro, but a tech bro from the 17th century, Isaac Newton, said, "If I have seen further, it is because I've stood on the shoulders of giants." A friend of mine once said, "If I've seen further, it's because I've looked down the right end of the telescope." And that really emphasizes how important it is to get your point of view right. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to talk about two different ways of seeing things that are really, really useful for the point of view of managing software development. But they're also really useful from the point of view of trying to do any complex task. But before we start with that, I just want to go through, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this is because I think software is eating everything and it's an interesting idea. Why should you be listening to me? Well, you should be listening to me, I think, because I've been involved in software development and project management for over 30 years now. So I'm long in the tooth, I've had lots and lots of experience, and I've seen it go wrong in all the ways that it can possibly go wrong. I hope there aren't any new ones I can see. But why you? Why should you be interested in this? Why should you be interested in listening to what I've got to say? Well, I think it's probably straightforward. If you've got anything to do with software development or the software development industry, anything to do with programming, etc., do you want to use the umbrella of?
What about you?
I'll be all right. So, if you're involved in writing software, involved in managing projects that write software, I think I've got something interesting to tell you. But I think also maybe I might have something interesting to tell you if you're in a second group, which is people who are involved in organizations or involved in societies, involved in parts of what's going on in the world that have become more and more dependent on software, so that have been eaten by software. Then it might be interesting that what I have to tell you. And then there's a third group, which I think, and this is pretty cheeky, but I think it's true, everybody else. I think everybody else might also be worth them listening to what I have to say, because we're in a world where software is occupying more and more of what happens in the world, but also we're in a world where we have to do quite complex things. We have to become involved in projects that have to involve other people. We have to get things done. And a lot of what I talk about in this talk is not just about software and software development, it's about how complex it is to get things done. So that's why now, why you, and why me. I'm going to start by talking about one way of looking at projects, which is to see all projects as bets. This might seem radically different to the idea that you have of how project management works, but think about it in this way. Anything that you try and do that is not completely straightforward has a chance of not going right. There's a chance of failing. And so in that sense, a project, especially a software development project, certainly has a chance of not going right. It's a bet. Now, one of the things that you might think that you could do about this is that you could worry about all the possible ways that a project could go wrong. You could think about all the possible details, all the different ways that a project could go wrong, all the ins and outs and all the intricacies. And the problem with that is, once the project gets to any kind of decent level of complexity, that could take forever. That would be a very, very expensive and time-consuming thing in itself, and it wouldn't necessarily guarantee that things would go any better. So what actually happens is not that, and it took me a long time to realize what actually happens. What actually happens is, sooner or later, somebody shrugs their shoulders and says, fuck it, we're gonna do this. That's what actually happens. All projects that are going, all projects that are happening, there may have been some thought about, well, what happens if we do this, what happens if we do that, but at some point somebody has to actually have said, fuck it. That's game number one, saying fuck it. But the interesting thing about game number one is that game number one then kicks off game number two. So think about it. If you're the person who shrugged your shoulders and said, fuck it, you've taken the risk, where do you want to be if this project goes completely disastrously wrong? You want to be nowhere near it. You want to be as far away as possible. If this project pays off, where do you want to be? You want to be there accepting the award and getting the promotion and getting the dividends, right? So if you're the person who kicked this project off, you're playing this second game. This second game has a name. A chap called Venkatesh Rao mentions it in a book called The Gervais Principle. He calls it heads I win, tails you lose. So if you can put yourself in a situation where when things are going well, you're going to be around and you're going to take credit, and when things aren't going well, you're going to be nowhere to be seen, there's a couple of things. That means that you're more comfortable saying fuck it, because you think, well, if things go well, I'll be around. If things aren't going so well, nobody will ever heard of me. But the other thing is, it makes you more likely to do it on more and more projects, and on more risky projects, right? So those are the projects that you're probably going to find yourself on, is a project where somebody has shrugged their shoulders and said, fuck it. They're going to be around if things go well, they're not going to be around if things go badly. That's game two. Then there's a third game, and this is a game called The Hiding Hand. It's called The Hiding Hand. It's kind of a pun on The Guiding Hand, which is the idea of Adam Smith, the early economist, that prices find their way magically because there's some kind of hand that decides where the prices are. So it's kind of an economic joke, and in being an economic joke, it's theoretically funny. And the idea of the hiding hand is discussed by a chap called Albert Hirschman, who had a very colourful career, born in Berlin, as a Jewish person born in Berlin, ran away from Germany just before the Second World War, fought in the French army and then fought in the American army, was much more impressed by the American army than the French army, because the American army had bullets and guns, which apparently the French army didn't. But then, after all of this, he was then an interpreter for Nazis accused of war crimes in the Nuremberg trials, and then after that he became somebody very senior in the World Bank, and then eventually worked for the Federal Reserve in America. And when he was working for the World Bank, he noticed something very interesting, which is that when projects were being kicked off, these projects that were funded by the World Bank in South America and Asia, etc., everybody kind of looked the other way at any of the serious problems that these projects might have had until the projects were really up and going and the money was getting paid. Because, of course, everybody wants to get paid. Everybody wants these projects to happen. Everybody wants the money to be invested. Everybody wants jobs. Everybody wants stuff to work. And this is exactly the same with the software development projects. We've had somebody saying, fuck it. We've had the heads I win, tails you lose. Now what we're on to is the hiding hand, which of course, whoever it was who kicked the project off, they're very keen to conceal any problems the project might have. Whoever it is who's going to get the work to deliver the project, they're very keen to conceal whatever it is that's problematic, right? So we've got these three games going on all at once. And as a result of that, we end up with a fourth game, which is very, very closely connected to the hiding hand game, which is slightly different, which I call project management theatre. So we have charts that show that the project is going to be definitely deliverable. Mysteriously, these charts hardly ever show that the project's not going to be deliverable. They show that it's going to be delivered exactly on the deadline when it needs to be delivered. We have lots of ceremonies, we have stand-up meetings, and we have show and tells, and all these kinds of things to show that the project is deliverable, to show that we're doing the project management. And this is connected to the hiding hand. It's a way of covering up what's really, really going on. Now, at this point, you might think this is all a bit depressing because the thing was risky to start with, and the person who took that risk is probably not going to be around if things go badly wrong. The team are covering up any serious problems. The project managers are pretending that everything is fine. Is there any way at all that we can actually make this project successful? The interesting thing is there is, and it's in this thing called game number 5. And game number 5 is cheating. What do I mean by cheating? Well, when you bet on a horse, that's pretty much it. You bet on the horse. There's nothing else you can do. You can't really improve the odds or anything. But when you're in a project, okay, somebody has bet on the horse. Somebody has bet on this project in delivering and paying off. But there are actually things, if you're the project manager, that you can do to improve the chances of it succeeding. You can actually talk to the people who might use this software and find out what they really want. You can find any really serious problems with the project and you can remove them. You can also get working software, small bits of working software, and deliver it to the people who are actually going to use it in the end, and then get feedback from them, right? So yes, I'm calling it cheating, but this is actually what you're really doing is you're reducing the odds of the thing not paying off. You're giving yourself the best chance possible of the project paying off. And so all of the craziness that's happened to kick this project off, there's almost nothing you can do to stop that. You can rail against it, you can get upset with it, and I have tried, believe me, right? But none of that actually works. What you can do is you can start to find out what will actually be valuable to the users and also what will actually be valuable to the organization. And you can start to build that. And if you get to that point where it's genuinely valuable, lo and behold, whoever it was who said fuck it is going to be standing next to you saying what a great idea it was that I decided to do this. That's how it actually works. There's another thing that you can do to give a project the best chance of success, which is much more difficult, but is still really important to understand, and that is understand when what you need to do is to up the stakes. So somebody might have made a bet that this piece of software will be used by a lot of people and they like it, etc. But they may not have actually bet enough. They may not have actually bet enough money or bet on enough things for it to really pay off. A classic example of this is any kind of platform where people get to say stuff, but they've forgotten to do any kind of moderation, right? So like the idea is, oh, everybody can be free, everybody can say stuff. But in fact, what you need is you also need a bunch of people stopping some people saying stuff, because some of the stuff people say on the internet is just amazingly horrible, right? So in order for the thing to really pay off, what you need is you need an extra bit. You need to up the stakes. You need to bet more in order to really succeed. There's a final game that is important that I should tell you about, which is, I said not all projects are bets. Not all projects are bets. Some things are absolutely sure things, but they're not surefire successes, they're surefire failures. Some things are so dumb as bets that they're never going to succeed. Does anybody know what an accumulator is? Do you know what an accumulator is?
No.
Right. So an accumulator is when you bet on not just one horse, you bet on 3 horses or 4 horses, and the money you get from one horse goes on to the next horse, and then the money that you get from that horse goes on to the next horse, and then the money you get from that horse gets on to the next horse, if they win.
Okay.
Right? If they don't win, you get nothing, right? But of course, the odds of each of those horses, they don't add up, they multiply, right? So if you bet on a 10-to-1 horse and then you bet on a 10-to-1 horse, that's 100-to-1 chance of you winning. If you bet on a 10-to-1 horse and a 10-to-1 horse and a 10-to-1 horse, that's 1,000-to-1 win, right? So you might find yourself working on projects that are not sensible bets of any kind. They are what I call nonsense accumulators, right? So they've got 2 or 3 aspects to them that are all completely nonsense. So good examples of this are, the deadline is ridiculous. They're trying to do something that is heavily regulated and they haven't talked to the regulators. True story. They're insisting that everybody comes into the office but there's no Wi-Fi. True story. You're forbidden to talk to the people who actually know how this thing should work. True story. If all of those things are happening at the same time, if it's a ridiculously ambitious deadline and you're not allowed, and you haven't talked to the regulators, and there is no Wi-Fi, and you're not allowed to talk to people, that project is going to fail. And I think it's beholden on me to say, if you're working on that kind of project, you should, I want to quote here the great thinker and philosopher Kenny Rogers, who says, you've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. And sometimes you have to run. Okay, so that's the first way of seeing projects that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about another way of looking at projects now. And I know that it's May, but I want you to imagine that it's Christmas. I want you to imagine that it's Christmas and you're in a big toy store. And the reason that you're in this big toy store, it's January actually, it's not Christmas, it's January. The reason that you're in this toy store is because you promised your son that you would buy him a robot dog. And before Christmas, they didn't have any robot dogs. So now you're here in January trying to find this robot dog. And you bump into your neighbor. And you hardly ever see your neighbor because you're both so busy, so busy working. And he's there trying to buy this robot dog as well. And you have a chat about how weird it is that you both seeing each other. And this is the only time you ever see each other, is like in New Year in toy stores. And your neighbor laughs in a kind of cynical way and says, it's no coincidence. And you say, well, what do you mean it's no coincidence? And he says, well, I bet little Jimmy, your son, I bet he saw lots of adverts for that robot dog before Christmas, didn't he? And he said, yeah, sure he did. And then he said, oh, well, I bet you promised it then, didn't you? I said, yeah, I did. And he said, oh, and then you couldn't find one? You couldn't find one of these robot dogs? No, I couldn't. And he said, like, and then after Christmas, you'd still promised him, so you bought him something else for Christmas, but now here you are. I said, yeah, how do you know all this? He said, well, this is how toy companies work. They create an artificial scarcity because they know that you're going to make a promise to your children and then you're going to fulfill this promise after Christmas. So you get really angry about this and you say, well, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to let big toy push me around. And then the neighbour laughs at you again. Your neighbour's getting pretty annoying by this point. And he says, you're not. You're going to go and buy that robot dog, because what kind of person doesn't honour promises that they've made to their children? Now, this principle that is being used by toy companies is one of the most powerful forces that can be used to manipulate people's behaviour, and it's known. The example I've just used is taken from a book by a psychologist called Robert Cialdini, and that principle is known as commitment and consistency. And the idea here is that we like to keep our promises. We like to we like to make commitments. We like to honour our commitments, and we like to be consistent with what we said. Why would we do that? Well, if we're going to think about some kind of cartoon version of prehistoric man and woman, when we were living in small groups, we want to be the kind of people who kept our word. It would be very dangerous for us to not be the kind of people who kept our word. And this is a very, very powerful urge. But what we've seen from the example of the Toy Story is that marketing people know about this and can use it to manipulate us. When I run training courses on project management, one of the first things I do on the first day is I get people to write on a big sheet of paper lots and lots of words and phrases that they associate with a project that's going well, with a project that's kind of happy, and a project that's working out. And very often the first two things that they write down are on time and to budget. On time and to budget are about keeping a promise. They're about a commitment, about honouring a commitment. So this is one of the fundamental things about what people think project management is about. People think project management is about commitment and consistency. The brutal thing is that, of course, projects are inherently uncertain things. Remember what we were saying about bets. Projects are inherently uncertain things. You can't really commit, and you can't really be consistent. There are all sorts of surprises. So if we were being asked to make honest commitments about delivering on time and to budget, that would be bad. But as I've just kind of mentioned when we were talking about toys, very often the kind of commitment that we've been asked to make when we're talking about projects is not an honest commitment. We've been manipulated in some way. Robert Cialdini calls this commitment and consistency jiu-jitsu. So very often a typical thing that happens with project management is you've been asked to bid for a piece of work, and you're basically told, if you don't make a very low bid, in terms of cost and time, you won't get the work. So this is not an honest bid that you've made. You've been manipulated into saying that this is going to take longer than you probably think, shorter than you probably think it should, or it's going to be cheaper than you think it should. You have to say all these things. You've been manipulated in some way. That's almost, in a way, that's more fool you if you've been tricked into that kind of situation. But a more straightforward kind of commitment and consistency jiu-jitsu, which I wish it didn't work, but it does, is for whoever the boss is, very probably the person who said fuck it in the betting process, is said, I've just told somebody, I've promised somebody that this will happen for this date and it will take this amount of time, and because I've promised it, you've promised it. How can that work? How can that actually be a promise? But it does work. It's a form of commitment and consistency jiu-jitsu. So it would be bad enough if projects were just about keeping promises that were honest and straightforward promises, but it's worse than that, because you're manipulated into doing things that you don't really want to do. How can you fight back against this? How can you fight back against this manipulation of commitment and consistency? And the fact that it will make you feel bad. This is the thing about commitment and consistency. It's why it's so powerful as a driving force, is because it will make you feel bad. Well, there are a couple of things that you can try. One is, I'm going to use another quote here from an American poet and writer called Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, I'm a bit hazy about exactly what he means by hobgoblin, but I don't think it's something good. And the Cialdini talks about this in his book, and he picks out, he says what's important about that phrase, or something that we can hang on to, is the foolish bit. So it's foolish to be consistent with something that you didn't want to do in the first place, that you were forced into committing to. That's a foolish kind of consistency. And that's important to bear in mind. If you've been forced into promising something that you didn't really want to promise, one way of like feeling less bad about it is to think about it in terms of it being a foolish inconsistency. The second thing is you can do your own jujitsu. So the interesting thing about commitment and consistency is that it applies to everybody. Everybody is vulnerable to it. So yes, you might have people who are plotting and conniving to manipulate you into committing to things, but you can also ask them to commit to things. And the things that you want them to commit to are very closely related to things that we were talking about when we were talking about games 5 and 6 in the previous one, in the betting way of looking at things. So if you say to the people who are asking you to commit to something, yes, I can commit to this, but I need a commitment from you that when I encounter something difficult, I encounter a problem, then we can talk about it in a sensible way. I need a commitment from you that if it emerges that we need to put in more effort, we need to put in more investment, I can talk to you about this in a sensible way and we can come to some sensible conclusion. That doesn't mean they'll honour that commitment, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to use commitment and consistency in the other way. And then the final thing is to do what Saddam Hussein would do. Now, you may say, Saddam Hussein, slightly controversial figure, I agree with that, but he did say something very interesting, which really fits with the idea of commitment and consistency, and this is what he said. He said that politics is where you say that you're going to do one thing, you fully intend to do another thing, and then you end up doing something completely different to both. And that is an account of politics, but also that is a pretty good account of what project management is about. Now, we can take that learning from Saddam Hussein without a lot of the other things that came along with it when it was Saddam Hussein. So if we can do that, but at the same time, we can deliver something that is valuable to our users, valuable to the people that we're doing the project for, but also crucially doesn't hurt us in the process, then we can be doing something that is honouring a kind of higher commitment. It's honouring a commitment to do the best for your users, do the best for the people who are hiring you, but also doing the best for yourself. So those are the two ways of looking at projects that I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to come up with a little conclusion, just reminder of what we talked about. We talked about bets. The conclusion we came to with bets is that you can talk to users, you can cheat, and if you can't cheat, you should run.
Bets allowed.
And the conclusion that we came to around project management and promises was that you can fight back. You can use commitment and consistency to fight back, and you should look after yourself, and if all else fails, just remember what Saddam Hussein would do. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.